Hello everyone, and welcome back to the weekly Roundup. This is me, Saud, and with me is Ash. Ash, how are you doing?
I'm good yourself, Sam.
I'm doing excellent. I've got an great topic to talk about today, and I'm sure our listeners would be very interested as well. And I'll jump right into it. So, everyone's been looking at headlines about the labor market, and it seems to be a bit of a roller coaster ride. And
hmm
so I decided to dig in. And one headline I found that stood out was the labor market is tight, and there are thousands of layoffs. And that doesn't make sense to me because I don't do research on the labor market. I'm not an expert, but I started to dig in and break down this headline. The labor market is tight and there are thousands of layoffs. So what does it mean that the labor market is tight? It means that it's harder for companies to find skilled workers, skilled labor. Now, if you think of it, it's hard for companies to find skilled labor, but then thousands of skilled laborers or workers are being laid off. That doesn't make
Yeah,
sense. I think that's a big contradiction, isn't it, Ash? Yeah.
yeah, it is, isn't it? I always find this because I remember reading this ages ago, maybe 15 years ago. I was doing something for work, I think it was, and I remember reading something similar then. And there's always, and I think at the time, my conclusion I got to was that there's a lag, and there's a demand occurs and you go to the labour market and the labour market's not quite there because the demand outstrips the capabilities out there. And if you think about, getting a skilled worker in, whether it's in IT or any other kind of discipline, there's a huge lag behind it from going to university or doing your qualifications to having the experience to get into work. It's not
Mm.
something you can kind of access quite quickly. And the same applies for because funny enough, a friend of mine was emigrating to Australia,
Yeah.
and they've got loads of challenges around skilled work, so whether it's in the medical industry or even electricians.
Mm.
And the challenge is they invest a ton of money into the education system and infrastructure to try and bring people through,
Yeah.
but it's going to take 10, 15 years for that to happen. And so they always find themselves occasionally in a dip, and that might be because a whole lot of people have retired or something's happened, and now we've got this gap again, and we suddenly need to go, oops, I need to go back to the beginning of the conveyor belt and put loads of
And
stuff back on it. But I need to be patient now because it's not going to be immediate.
and that makes sense. A lag is a very good reason for this to happen. The labor, like demand for high skilled laborers and a lot of skilled labor being laid off at the same time. But in this case, it's something quite different to this specific scenario that's happening for the past couple of months. And let me know when you can see my screen because I've got something nice to show you.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Oh, I love it. Love a graph. There you go.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So this graph is from the Harvard Business Review, and their source is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And if you look on the left side, so it shows the percentage of labor force which is laid off, and the figures we're seeing is 1% and 2%. So historically, for the past 20 years, this figure has been around 1.5% on average. When the figure hits close to 2%, it means that it's a softer labor market. It's an employer's market. That means there's a lot of people looking for jobs and less hiring, so employers control the market. When the percentage is closer to 1%, it means that there's less people looking for jobs and employers are looking for more people. So that means there's a tight market. So if you look at 21, 22, and 23 figures at the bottom right, shaded in yellow, you can see
hmm
that the percentage is historically low for the past 20 years. So what that made me realize is that all of these headlines, they're mostly just headlines, because 5 years ago we were in a worse, there were more layoffs than there are in these few months. 10
Yeah.
years ago there were more layoffs than there are in these months of 2023. So that got me thinking, one, why are there so many layoffs, even if it's historically low? And two, why is hiring a challenge? So I'll go into why there were so many layoffs first. Well, for one, for one, in 200 tech companies laid off 100,000 workers in 2023, and most of them are technology companies.
hmm
And why did they do that? They did that because during COVID, people moved on to online sources for entertainment and for spending their time and for earning money. So tech companies got a natural boost due to COVID, and they hired a lot more people to work and uh, keep their services operating effectively.
Yeah.
And now that COVID's gone, those demand has reduced. And if you look at the figures, if you look at pre-COVID employment figures and employment figures today, those tech companies still have more employees than they did before COVID, despite these
Yeah.
massive layoffs. So it just puts a big question mark on what these layoffs actually mean in a broader scale. What do you think?
No, and I think, and when you think about it, and I think we talked about this in the past. COVID kind of accelerated digitization.
Yeah,
And so you had a lot of industries that historically were, face-to-face type industries, suddenly had to go online and suddenly had to have huge amounts of, capability online. And one of the kind of industries, travel, for example. So obviously travel was impacted anyway. But when we started seeing some green shoots, then we found that a lot of the travel moved away from high street and moved online, and
yeah,
they needed to up their capability. A lot of retailers suddenly realized that they couldn't access their consumer base face to face, so they had to shift it online. So you suddenly all these programs and projects stand up, and you suddenly need a quick acceleration to go from I need to create, a shopping basket. I need to have an online presence. I need to. So to your point, suddenly a massive spike in that, and
yeah,
it doesn't surprise me that although it's kind of dropped, it still stayed higher because if the proportion of sales through digitization is a lot higher now post COVID than it was pre COVID,
yep,
and all of that needs someone maintaining servers, someone updating software, all of the fun stuff that comes with a tech stack needs to still happen. So you suddenly get all of this. I think the other bit to it is payments. And the payment industry is, again, there's been a massive shift, and cash has dropped off a cliff as a result of COVID. And at the same time, we've introduced, or e-money has kind of come in, and all of these organizations are standing up trying to get the end-to-end payment market. And again, that takes tech, that takes technology, that takes all this stuff, and to support it and build it. So it doesn't surprise me it's not dropped too much, and that kind of explains the spike because of all these project type one-off exercises where you need people to come in and build stuff for you, and then we now move to kind of maintenance almost. So you still need to retain some level of staffing, but you can't, but not to the degree of building stuff.
exactly. Well said. And one point you said regarding moving from physical to online, that was something that we're still seeing right now. In
Yeah,
because the layoffs and the hiring, they're happening in different departments of organizations.
yeah,
So they're happening in different fields. So it doesn't mean
yeah.
everyone's being laid off because of
No,
financial reasons. It means that the structure of businesses and demand and customer preferences, that's changing. And the layoffs
yeah,
and the hiring is just a result, different outcome of that. Uh, and to summarize what we've talked about and what we've studied, the Wall Street Journal reported that nearly 80% of downsized tech workers found new roles within 3 months. So the market, there are layoffs, but the market is good at the same time. It's weird times.
yeah.
I don't understand this. But the second thing is companies laid off 100,000 employees this year, and
Yep.
we're only one month into it. But at the same time, they added 500,000 jobs to the market as well. So the type of jobs in
Yeah,
demand are changing, and
yeah,
we've
yeah,
talked
yeah.
about this in previous podcasts today.
We have.
There will be new types
Yeah,
of jobs that we've not imagined, and corporate structure will change accordingly.
yeah. No, I agree. And we, interest of the last episode we talked about, generative AI,
Yeah.
and so suddenly you've got, there's a perfect example of the kind of copywriting industry. So copywriting industry, you might have spent a lot of your headcount was copywriters.
Hmm.
People sitting down writing tons of content for you. All the cool stuff you see on social media. That's a person writing it. Now you imagine in 10 years' time where most of the work now is the technology people supporting the AI that's doing writing the content for you. So actually, you still don't need the content writers. You now need the technologists to
Yep.
support the servers, the platforms, all of that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, you can see the outcome from a consumer doesn't shift, but behind the scenes, the thing that's making it is changing dramatically. But often it's not visible because as a consumer, you're still going to see the social media stuff, and you're still going to read the pieces in the newspapers, or well, not the newspapers, but online.
Yeah.
But the thing that are writing it is changing, and how
Changing.
it's being done is changing.
Yeah.
Very interesting. That's a good one. Right. So my one was quite an interesting one. So I was chatting to Sophia. She's reading this book called Street Child, which is this book based in the Victorian era, which then connected me to a piece I was reading in the earlier on in the week, where it talked about, I think it was the Leeds Building Society did a bit of research around the cost of housing in proportion to average earnings. And it's the highest it's been since the Victorian era, since the 1800s, where it's currently at 9.2 times an average earning is the average price of a house. Now, the last time that proportion existed was, Victorian era. And in those days, only kind of, aristocracy, landed gentry, the posh folk, the rich folk with the land were able to buy houses. And if you were below that, you just could never afford a house. And the kind of parallels are, you look at the average first-time buyer, and the age has gone up and up and up. It's now somewhere in the, mid to late 30s now, whereas in the 1950s, people in their 20s were buying houses quite commonly. So it's the highest it's ever been. And that tells you one thing. But then, to your point about facts and data and stats, I always kind of look at this stuff and you think, right, that's telling me a story. So the other thing I kind of compared to at the time was the cost of a loaf of bread. Now, the cost of a loaf of bread back in those days was 2p. And that used to be 15% of the average weekly income, 15%. So if I did the maths, and I think the average salary in the UK is somewhere in the region of 20k.
Yeah.
And so that would mean a loaf of bread would be somewhere in the region of about, £500 for a week. So it kind of shows that the proportions sometimes don't always work.
Yeah.
So 9.2 is, the average house price compared to salary. But if we were to take the same proportions from the Victorian era, a loaf of bread would cost £500. Which clearly it doesn't. But it's always interesting to me for two reasons. One, how this kind of disparity is growing, because certainly in the UK hasn't got any bigger in terms of the size of the island since the 1800s. The island is a finite island and it's not going to grow any bigger. And the same applies to kind of most of the world. It's quite static. And, as climate change is suggesting, if anything, it's getting smaller. And so it does not surprise me that the price of housing is going up. And the question is whether we think that the salaries are proportionally going up or not, or are other things getting cheaper, like a loaf of bread? Because a loaf of bread in the 1800s was very expensive because, wheat and all this sort of stuff that you had to grow, you had to transport it, very difficult, very challenging. Fruit was, you can have fruit. In Victorian era, people used to have a pineapple, and that used to be on display because it was so rare to have one pineapple that people used to display it. So we certainly don't have that. So it's always interesting, these stats, how do you really understand whether are we really living in a society where it's much more expensive to buy things, or is that specifically just on property? And that's always going to grow and grow and grow, the disparity, because we're never going to get more land unless we find a home on Mars.
Yeah. Quite interesting topic you've chosen, because I've got a lot of thoughts on my mind regarding this. The first thought is that there are two ways we can understand how expensive things have become. The first is that my father could easily buy a house in his 30s. And I don't think I'm not even thinking about buying a house right now. So that's a qualitative element to it. And then there's a quantitative element to it. And I think the biggest figure that people throw around is inflation. how much things have gone expensive, similar to what you were talking about. And what made me think was, one, people's spending habits have changed. So the way inflation is calculated has to change as well. The basket of goods that they use to calculate inflation is maybe not as accurate right now as it used to be 10 years ago, because in inflation calculators, you don't include the Netflix subscription, how much that has increased over the years, the price of gym memberships, or how our spending structures have changed. And I think if you relate that to salaries as well, salaries have not been increasing for a while, but we've seen some increases in the past year or so related to the previous topic we were talking about, being a tight labor market. But other than that, I don't think that people's purchasing power is quite dramatically increasing as strong as expenses are, especially when it comes to housing. I was looking at the house price in the area I live in. The area I live in sold flats for £150,000 in 2014, and now it's £250,000. So that's a big increase over 7-8 years.
7-8 years. Yeah.
7-8 years. So and I'm sure salaries haven't increased by that number. So
No.
So I think we'll go back to only the rich having houses and everyone else living on rent.
Well, this, and that was the kind of the summary of that that piece, which is: are we getting to a position where either it becomes a generational thing, which is if you had a house in your family, you pass the house on to your next generations. But if you're genuinely new on the housing ladder, unless you're wealthy or you've got wealthy parents, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get yourself onto the ladder. Certainly anywhere near the age, you might have done in, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Different time.
Different time. But you're quite right. The kind of the holistic view of, what people do in terms of purchasing and, what's their lifestyle like and all the differences. Again, it was interesting. There was on that piece when I was looking at it, most people spending in the kind of 1800s is pretty much all food. Basic staples. That's why it costs such a big proportion of their salary, because they were paid. There was no such thing as a minimum wage, and therefore you were paid very, very little, and therefore 80 to 90% of your cost was food. Now, houses in those days were a little bit cheaper because there was lots of space, and most people were building their own houses anyway with wood and mud pretty much. So you didn't really have big housing estates being built by building contractors. You literally went and found a little village and then built a house out yourself in the corner. So it's different kind of focus in those days. But yeah, I always find these stats interesting because you can kind of draw whatever conclusion you want really out of this. But no, that was my little interesting fact I found.
I think that was quite interesting, and it's given me a lot of ideas for future episodes as well, housing market and everything. But that was good overall. Hope the viewers learned something and found it interesting. If you have any suggestions for next week, please let us know in the comments below, or just email us at theartsdialogue.info@gmail.com. And with that, see you next week.
Cheers. Bye-bye, everyone.
If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And if you want similar content, check out our other videos.